On January 5th, New York City implemented congestion pricing. As a longtime New York City resident and someone who drives on those highways at least 2 to 3 times a week, I was curious on the effects that the tolls would have on daily driving in New York City. Before we get into the data, I want to clarify a few things. First is that this is not a political advertisement. Therefore, I am not favoring any specific candidate. It has nothing to do with policy. This is just a view of the factual things that are happening in New York City. Point number two is I am an individual on this project. There are no other outside sources, neither am I being paid to send any of this information out. And part three, this video is very specific only to driving times. This has nothing to do with the economic impact, things surrounding that, or other key variables that people are concerned about politically. Now let's take a look at how I am measuring this information. I picked three clear destinations. We have Brooklyn, New York, 11228 is our starting zip code, Flushing, Queens, and then we finally end in Bryant Park. I felt like it was very centered towards Manhattan. And then we'll be looping all the way back down, back to Brooklyn. So we'll be taking the I-278 or the BQE. Some of these routes do vary with the LIE and or the GCP, favoring from either Brooklyn to Flushing or Flushing to Manhattan. So those can vary in some of the statistics here. But otherwise, most of the routes should stay consistent, but it does capture the FDR Drive, the BQE, as well as parts of the GCP. Something I want to highlight that the data does not capture are things like accidents, lane closures, or construction. These things do have significant impacts on the ETA. That's not being reflected here, so we can identify some of these outliers, but they are not being captured specifically. Point number two is best route is a loose definition by Google, so that does not necessarily mean the fastest route. Neither do we make a distinction on whether or not these routes are paid for or entering the congestion zone. Let's look at our first route, Brooklyn to Flushing. And as you can see, depending on the time of day I take this, Brooklyn to Flushing, the best route could be through the BQE, through the LIE, or the Belt Parkway through the Van Wyck. Some of these things we can't necessarily reflect. We just have the ETA associated with that. Let's take a look at our first graph here. So we have the driving times from Brooklyn to Flushing. On the y-axis here, we have the time that it takes to drive from Brooklyn to Flushing specifically in minutes. On the x-axis here, we have the time of day that that point represents, and each line / color is going to be a different day of that week. One thing I do want to note is that 1 a.m. through 5 a.m. is not being tracked because of the fact that there are so little cars at that time, and it just might not be that relevant because not many of us are driving during those times. So the first thing I want to point out here is that 25 minutes seems to be our fastest ETA, the fastest time that we can drive, as well as our largest increases happen from 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. all the way up to 7 a.m. We can see from 7 a.m. to around 9 a.m. we have a pretty consistent trend when it comes to the amount of time it will take to drive between these two destinations. We see a huge decrease though from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. and that we can assume is from people, finally reaching their destination with work and things like that. And we see a consistency in between here with 3 to 4 p.m. seeing its biggest increases, as well as our largest decreases from 6 to 7 p.m., which starts from all the way up here around, and we see a sharp, steep decline here. One thing I do want to point out with this is that for the first week of congestion pricing, our highest ETA was 1 hour and 5 minutes. Let's jump into week number 2. We're going to see a very similar pattern to what we already had for week number 1, where 5 a.m. and everything in the early a.m.s are going to be extremely low ETAs. We're going to see a big jump from 5 a.m. to 6 a.m. That's going to be our sharpest increase on this graph, as well as a consistent uptrend in ETA all the way up to 8 a.m. And then we're going to see a downtrend after 8 a.m. towards 9 a.m. and 10 a.m. And things are going to start picking back up again from 11 to 3. And 3 p.m. from Brooklyn to Flushing seems to be the worst time to drive. I imagine it's because kids are getting out of school, people are going to pick up their children, and things like that. And from then on out, we'll see it kind of linger, go down, and at 7 p.m. we're going to see the sharpest, from 6 to 7 p.m. we're going to see the sharpest decline in ETA. So leaving around 7 p.m. would be ideal if you can, as it would be the fastest way to get home. Let's look at our third graph here, which is Brooklyn to Flushing, week number 2, but specifically during rush hour. Rush hour is defined as 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. all the way up to 7 p.m. So this graph does feature a break in the data, but this does provide greater clarity since this is the time that most people are going to experience the highest volume of traffic. One thing I do want to point out here is when the data clumps together for every single day. If the dots are clumping closer together, it's safe to assume that the ETA for that time can remain relatively consistent. As we can see at 3 p.m., you're going to see the largest fluctuations in traffic. You can have great days under 50 minutes or days that are absolutely awful, which also is our highest data point of the longest time it would take, which is 1 minute or 1 hour and 10 minutes. And from this graph, we can see that your best bet is to, if you want to drive the fastest, is going to be if you want to leave in the morning. Leaving at later in the day is going to have most likely kids getting out of school, parents picking up their children, people are starting to leave work early if they do, and 5 p.m. to 3 p.m. is the absolute worst time to drive from Brooklyn to Flushing. And we're going to see a sharp decline at 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. with these times dropping from 60 something minutes all the way down to less than 45 minutes for that week. Let's look at our second route here, which is Flushing to Manhattan. And as you can see, from Flushing to get to Bryant Park, you're going to involve a little bit of the Van Wyck, parts of the LIE. If not the Van Wyck, we're going to go through the GCP and meet back onto the LIE to go to Bryant Park. Let's look at our first graph of our second route here, which is Flushing to Manhattan, week number 1. So we only have 4 days listed here. And one thing I want to draw attention to right away is the data range itself. So the ETA starts at around 18 something minutes, as well as peaking around 45 as of for week number 1. And we're going to identify the same exact trends here, which is that rush hour is going to be the absolute worst. We're going to see a lot less driving time in between 10 a.m. all the way up until 3 p.m. 3 p.m. we'll see a larger spike in the ETA and a huge fall off in driving time from 5 to around 7 p.m. And once we get past 7 p.m., it's pretty much the fastest times that we can drive at with some traffic on the road. Let's look at Flushing to Manhattan week number 2. The first thing I want to call your attention to is going to be the additional day on this graph. So this is a 5-day week as compared to last week, which is a 4-day week. The first thing you'll notice is going to be the trends are around the same from last week. We have the same pickup times where the ETA is starting to increase dramatically. We have the same fall off times. We have the same consistency throughout the day, and we see that ETA pick back up at 4 o'clock. One of the advantage this route has over the Brooklyn to Queens route is going to be the time that it starts falling off and the rate at which it falls off. 4 o'clock is going to get better as we get towards 5 o'clock, which is kind of not expected, but that is something unique to Flushing to Manhattan. And another thing that is really important to call out on this graph is going to be the highs of this graph. The highest point seems to be around 48 minutes, and with 2 dots here, we could tell that's kind of a consistent trend at 8 a.m. here. And that is an increase from the previous week. Previous week, we only saw a high of 43 minutes. So might be a little too early to say that it's getting worse or that congestion pricing is not helping this. We'll have to see more data to make a conclusive statement. Let's look at Flushing to Manhattan week number 2, but specifically during rush hour. We'll notice that during the beginning of the day, we're going to have some of our worst driving times. And once we get towards the 3 p.m. mark, we're going to see a fall off in the times. This is the opposite of Brooklyn to Flushing, because in Brooklyn to Flushing, we saw that it got worse as you drove later in the day, but it got better if you were leaving earlier in the day. So Flushing to Manhattan has the opposite effect. It seems like people are taking a route to go through Flushing to get to Manhattan, but they don't return from Manhattan to go back to Flushing. Now let's look at the route from Manhattan to Brooklyn. We can see that we can either take the West Side Highway through the tunnel to the 278 all the way back down, or we could take the right-hand side where we could take the FDR Drive, come down the Brooklyn Bridge, and kind of swirl our way back down to the 278. And as you can see, the most unideal route would definitely be the 495 all the way back down to the 278 and all the way back through Brooklyn. It's very likely that you're going to see either West Side Highway or FDR Drive. These are often the fastest routes plus the shortest distances, so that would most likely fall in our definition of best route. Let's look at Manhattan to Brooklyn week number 1. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that there are only 4 days worth of data on this chart, as well as on the x-axis, we have the full time range. Our best time to drive is going to be around 24 minutes. We see very consistent trends with the other graphs where we're going to have bigger pickups at 8 a.m., but not as dramatic. We're going to stay consistent all the way to 3 p.m. without many pickups in the middle from 8 to 10. And we're going to see a huge increase all the way up to 5 o'clock, which is going to be our worst times here. First thing I want to call out is that this is definitely an outlier point, right? This might be some traffic. This might be some of that construction that we said we can't reflect on the data. And I think we're going to be more realistic at around 50-ish minutes. And as we see going later in the day, it stays consistent with the drop-offs around 7 o'clock, and the best times are around when we are exiting the city around 8 o'clock. And this kind of shows here that not many people are leaving Manhattan to go to Brooklyn, especially in the morning, but definitely during the rush hour period when it's over, people are leaving from Manhattan to Brooklyn. Manhattan to Brooklyn, week number 2. We have 5 days worth of data here and the full day's worth of time on the bottom. Our best driving time is going to be 23 minutes. The trends are very consistent. The worst times to drive are going to be around 8 a.m. We're going to see consistency throughout the day until we hit that 5 p.m. mark. One thing I want to draw your attention to is going to be the highest time range here, and that is one day out of the week where we're going to see a 53-minute ETA. We're more likely to be around the 45 to 40-ish minute mark, so definitely an improvement in ETA from the previous week. But we are noticing greater fluctuations, right? Like this was definitely an outlier day. This seems to be a Thursday here, while most of the time you're going to experience times below 35 minutes. And we're going to see the same exact fall-offs as before. Greater fluctuation from Manhattan to Brooklyn. This might have been due to some traffic. This is why the graph is going to be a little bit more inconsistent with the times. Manhattan to Brooklyn, week 2 during rush hour with 5 days worth of data. And the first thing that does stand out to me is going to be the increase as time goes on throughout the day. It's very obvious that people are not driving from Manhattan to Brooklyn. You're most likely already working in Manhattan if you live in Manhattan, but people are commuting from Manhattan to Brooklyn, especially when the workday ends. And it does seem to stay relatively consistent. We do have an outlier here towards the end of the day, but you're typically going to see your ETA drop off. Now, after looking through the data, here are some of my key takeaways. The first point I want to make is that driving times have improved by maybe 10 to 30%, and that comes from someone who drives very often from Brooklyn to Manhattan, Manhattan to Queens, and Queens to Brooklyn. Times have improved. The range of time that you're spent in traffic, meaning like the highs of the time, is definitely lower based on my experience so far. Not only that, the amount of time that it stays the worst traffic has definitely improved. We're seeing fall-offs at 7 o'clock where I feel like back before congestion pricing, you would see that 1 hour and 10 minutes ETA from these destinations lingering maybe up until 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock. The second point I want to make is stay away from rush hour. Though impossible for a lot of people, these do seem to be when the driving times are the worst. Leaving at around 6 a.m., if possible 7 p.m. are when you're going to experience the best times to drive and the fastest ways to get home. Part number 3 is that it's just way too soon to tell. There's not enough data here to make any conclusive statements, but so far, I think it's gotten a lot better. With that in mind, what are your thoughts? Has congestion pricing improved the driving times? Has it worsened it? Or has it just stayed the same? Right? Everyone's going to have a different experience given that we all drive during different times. So, based on your specific time and when you drive, how has your experience with congestion pricing been so far?